As Carolyn is doing that, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Elias Aboujaoude. We're good? Okay, good. Elias and I were speaking a little bit earlier, and it looks like we first met about 20 years ago. So it's been a while ago. So Dr. Aboujaoude is a clinical professor, researcher, and writer at Stanford University's Department of Psychiatry, where he is chief of the Anxiety Disorders Section and director of the OCD Clinic and the Impulse Control Disorders Clinic. Besides the compulsivity-impulsivity spectrum, his work has focused on the intersection of technology and psychology, with an emphasis on the problematic use of internet-related technologies, mental health in a post-privacy world, and the access to care and advanced global health. Wait a minute, I think I missed something here, I'm sorry. And the potential for telemedicine interventions, such as virtual reality and video-based therapy, to increase access to care and advance global health. His books include Virtually You, The Dangerous Powers of the E-Personality, and Mental Health in the Digital Age, Grave Dangers, Great Promise. Dr. Aboujaoude also teaches psychology on the main Stanford campus and at UC Berkeley. Scholarly and media platforms that have featured his work include the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Congressional Quarterly, the Harvard Business Review, the Chronicle of Higher Education, BBC, PBS, and CNN. I think we just ran out of time. Dr. Aboujaoude, it's a pleasure to welcome you.
Thank you very much, Scott, for the kind introduction, and thank you, Scott and Carolyn, for this wonderful annual tradition. I know from being active on the clinical side that you've helped many patients and their families through this this annual gathering. I'm going to talk about AI and OCD today, but I'm going to put it in two contexts. The first context is the history of telepsychiatry. The second context is this psychology technology interface and everything that happens at this rich intersection. So we've studied over the years several negative activities and behaviors that are part of online psychology, from video game addiction to cyberbullying to the psychological effects of online privacy violations. And it's really a pretty depressing landscape. But if there's a silver lining, it's the field of telepsychiatry, the same technologies that brought us these very problematic tools are also creating a real revolution in terms of the field of telepsychiatry and the increase in access to care that it promises. And increase access is really important when you look at statistics such as this one, that only 26% of current mental health needs are met by current resources. So it's really impossible, if you think about it, impossible to address all the need without leveraging technology and tools such as the ones we're going to be covering. Now, it's often the case that we think of telepsychiatry as something that started with COVID or even ChatGPT, and this is so not the case. There's a 60-year history of people thinking about how technology tools can be utilized in ways that either increase access to care or provide care without the involvement of a therapist and a psychiatrist. And we're going to cover some of the components that together form the field of telepsychiatry, including things like early experiments in AI, using video technology to offer therapy, virtual reality, texting therapy, digital therapeutics, and so forth. So really a milestone study in our field is one by John Greist and his team, where they took 162 scenarios that are common in patients with OCD and developed an intervention that's self-paced, that patients can go through on their own after choosing what scenario best fits their symptoms. And they compared this software to in-person therapy with an actual therapist and to a waitlist control. And what they found was that this self-paced CD-ROM based intervention was almost as good as a treatment with an in-person therapist. So pretty revolutionary, pretty early data that speaks to the power of these tools when used appropriately. Of course, since then, the internet happened and all sorts of new things became possible. I was fortunate to have been part of a company that also included Jennifer Hoblin, if some of you remember her. She was a psychiatrist in our department, and a couple of Stanford MBA folks. And we started this platform to offer remote video-based therapy. And it's really interesting thinking back at this experience from almost 15 years ago now. It's really interesting to remember how folks reacted. So patients were really curious about it. Providers, on the other hand, both therapists and psychiatrists, were highly skeptical, including around things like, how can you assess body language, micro expressions, the patient-provider relationship. All these issues were really big on their minds. And fast forward to post-COVID and the shift that so many of us have had to make to remote video-based therapy. There's actually some data now, and we did this study, which was a meta-analysis. So a study of studies together. It included over 5,000 patients with any number of diagnoses, and video-based delivery performed nearly as well as in-person delivery in this study. So there's quite a bit of data now, and maybe this is why many therapists we know are very comfortable now providing remote video-based therapy and not eager to return to in-person treatment. Mobile therapy is another component within this telepsychiatry evolution. The first iPhone came around in 2007, and with it, text messaging became such a big part of our culture. And already back then, people were sending more texts than making phone calls, and companies like Talkspace thought to leverage that. If you look at this ad, emotions can be scheduled with unlimited messaging therapy. You can message your personal licensed therapist exactly when you feel like it. Start improving your life today for as little as $49 a week. So again, the idea of access was really prominent. Now we can debate whether this level of access is healthy when you want to encourage patients to problem solve and to become more independent. But still, this constituted its own sort of stage in this evolution of telepsychiatry. Another stage is so-called serious games. These are video games that are meant for purposes other than entertainment. And one big area that tried to leverage serious games is the so-called cognitive protection, brain training movement. And we'll talk a little bit about that and the problems with it. But this is considered its own sort of part within telepsychiatry. Virtual reality therapy, of course, also, especially within the field of anxiety and OCD, a lot of potential there, some good data there. And the idea is to use exposure response prevention that Carolyn mentioned, use virtual reality to achieve desensitization, to help patients not be triggered by the kinds of OCD or phobia stimuli that trigger them. The challenge with OCD is that it's so diverse and so endless that it's almost impossible to come up with a simulation for each and every OCD symptom. Now, this has changed some with the advent of AI, because AI can really help create these environments. But until a couple of years ago, it was a real challenge. So this is an example from an industry collaboration I had. This is treating acrophobia, or fear of heights, and the therapist can gradually increase the altitude, the height that the patient is at. You can go from being on a rooftop to being in an elevator, a plank. So you gradually increase and modify the height in a way that gradually increases the intensity of the triggers, which is how you want to do ERP, exposure response prevention. So that's VR. AI therapy, our main focus today, is something that, again, wasn't born with ChatGPT. The first experiment dates back to 1965. An MIT engineer by the name Joseph Weizenbaum, who created a program that he called Elias, that's based on Rogerian therapy. If you know Carl Rogers, he's the therapist behind Rogerian therapy, and he's the one responsible for some quintessential mental health and psychiatry questions, like how does that make you feel, or using encouragers like go on, what else, paraphrasing. So if you're someone who's developing a primordial, very sort of basic AI program, you can see why Rogerian therapy would be appealing. And indeed, the program that he developed, Eliza, is still available online. You can check it out and play with it. And it's really interesting in terms of how far it can get you before it trips in its output. So fast forward to contemporary AI therapy, and Wobot is really the first CBT chatbot, and it was rolled out on Facebook Messenger in 2017, and Stanford, it has roots at Stanford, Alison Darcy, Bart Taylor, etc. And what it did was validate emotions, remember past sessions, correct negative assumptions. The responses that Wobot would give you were pre-written by conversation designers working with therapists. So a specific user input would trigger a specific response from Wobot. It grew very quickly. It attracted a lot of funding, but earlier this year, it shut down. And it shut down to a large degree because users had moved on to generative AI models. So to platforms like ChatGPT, platforms that generate responses dynamically, not responses that were pre-written by conversation designers who have backgrounds in psychotherapy or mental health. So this ushered in a true sort of generative AI Wild West in terms of mental health treatment, and nearly half of mental health patients today will use LLMs for psychological support. And unlike Wobot, where there was direct therapist involvement and therapist input, these models are essentially untested. They were developed for general use, information, automation, etc., not for the provision of mental health care. So this comes with real public health consequences. And one of these consequences I was sort of struck to see in a study that we did published earlier this year, where we took 5 mental health conditions. We didn't have OCD, but we had anxiety and 4 other diagnoses. And we fed them into 4 popular LLMs. And we asked the LLM to give us both the diagnosis and the treatment recommendation. For each diagnosis, we had 3 versions. One version that was completely race neutral, one version that was race implied, and we implied the race by using a name that was heavily represented in a minority race versus race explicitly stated. And it was really interesting to see how different the recommendations were when you implied the race or you explicitly stated. So the systems were more likely to recommend heavy duty medications or locked treatment for minority patients, for example, than when the case was race neutral. So this is the kind of LLM world that we are interacting with when we approach these tools for mental health recommendations, mental health guidance, and mental health diagnostics. And this is what prompted Ash Golden in our group and myself to come up with a tool that folks can use to help assess AI tools on 6 crucial dimensions. So credibility, like what is the evidence base for this tool? User experience, how personalized is it? User agency, how does it protect my data, my privacy? Does it empower me or not? Bias, which I referred to in the earlier study, transparency, and how the tool acts in a crisis situation such as suicidality. So it's the scale takes you through these 6 dimensions and it scores them. And the advantage of having a score is that you can then compare across tools. And we did that by using the framework on the first AI tool that appears in the OpenAI store when you put OCD. And that tool is called OCD Coach. And we applied it across all dimensions. I'll just share with you the transparency dimension. So the first screen in OCD Coach tells you that the app was developed by Build Better, and it lists other AI tools that were also developed by Build Better. So a cheesecake menu guide, game crafter, picky food helper. You get to see this on the first screen, which is, it's a bit jarring, but it's transparent, so it's good, right? But it doesn't share info on ownership, on funding, on its business model, on the training material that they used to develop this tool. So we had our hypothetical user then ask for these details. And the app told us that it's Build Better is a technology company founded in 2020 by 3 developers in Palo Alto. It names them. It further explains that the company focuses on developing AI tools to enhance productivity, has raised $4 million, and has a team of 5. So, going back to our scale, the tool provided details upon request, but it did not offer full, immediate, and proactive this disclosure, which is why on this particular dimension, it scored 1 out of 2. So it just gives you an idea of how, what to look for and what dimensions to assess when interacting with these tools. Now, why are these tools as popular as they are? Think about OCD and some of the highly secretive, embarrassing, problematic symptoms that patients feel, patients can have. Intrusive thoughts about violence, for example, intrusive thoughts of a sexual nature, etc. With an LLM, patients can disclose information without fear of judgment. The LLM lacks social friction. The pushback that you can get from someone you're talking to about these things, the cues you can get from them that signal conversational limits, the fatigue that can happen, none of this is a factor in interacting with LLMs. LLMs, of course, are also endlessly available. They're also engagement oriented in their design. If you're going to Paris and you ask the LLM, what are the must-see sites I shouldn't miss, it'll happily give you those, but it'll also ask you if you want restaurants nearby that you might consider having lunch or dinner at. It also will ask you if you wanted to prepare a whole itinerary for you. So it's very engagement oriented. And for someone who's struggling, maybe alone, feeling isolated about their symptoms, this can be a highly attractive thing. The other uh, uh, um, issue is so-called sycophancy. Okay, and that's this endlessly agreeable quality that many LLMs have, like endless obedience to the user. They go out of their way to meet user expectations, and that, when it comes to OCD or several other conditions that we work with, can be problematic. Think of cognitive therapy, for example, and how the cognitive therapist is trained to confront so-called negative cognitions. This is problematic when it comes to LLMs and difficult to achieve. When it comes to OCD specifically, I'd like to highlight a few symptoms that can interface with LLMs in a problematic way. Think about reassurance seeking, for example, a very common symptom in OCD. And Ashley Golden came up with some really interesting quotes from Reddit, for example. I think the reason I ask the AI nowadays, otherwise I'd be asking my parents 100 times a day. There's a similar approach also when it comes to using companion AI chatbots like Character AI. So AI tools can make reassurance seeking too easy and more persuasive, without, again, the natural sort of blocks and natural friction that you would get if you're trying to do this with a human being. Or think of OCD and someone who has perfectionism. The LLMs will generate multiple options and continuously refine the responses. And this can contribute to endless cycles of optimizing for better outputs, which can feed perfectionistic tendencies. A similar dynamic can also play out in folks who have OCD with a need to know compulsion, or a need to confess compulsion. So it's a new world that both users, OCD patients, therapists, psychiatrists should be aware of, because 50% of patients, many of whom have these kinds of symptoms, are interacting with LLMs. So we need to incorporate an understanding of LLMs in our treatment recommendations and our assessment. There are other things that we can do and that can be part of the design. For example, you can write a statement instructing the model not to participate in compulsive loops and to prompt you if this behavior occurs. So just like you can write a prompt to ask for the perfect routing that will get you from San Francisco to New York, you can also prompt the model in a way that helps catch these loops and interrupt them. We can also build more guardrails. Current guardrails mostly focus on crisis scenarios, suicidality, psychosis, or legally regulated content, child pornography, etc. We can use new guardrails that offer things like break suggestions when someone is caught in a loop like this. We can also build in user-facing self-regulation tools, a customizable dashboard, for example, that shows you interaction metrics, the number of prompts, the repetition in terms of themes, optional limits that you can put on your interaction with LLMs. A lot of these have been used for smartphone addiction, quote unquote, but there's a parallel when it comes to LLMs, and I think the risks are potentially higher here. Involving behavioral health experts in design is something that can also change the equation in a good direction, and insisting on regulation. Another reason I wanted to go through earlier episodes or earlier components of telepsychiatry and not just focus on AI is because there are important lessons that are easy to miss if we don't do that. And I'll just end with a couple of these lessons. So Lumosity was one of those brain training startups that in its official, ads would say things like it'll protect against mild cognitive impairment, dementia, Alzheimer's disease. It'll reduce cognitive impairment associated with side effects of chemotherapy, post-traumatic disorder, traumatic brain injury, ADHD, Turner syndrome, stroke, and other health conditions. I mean, this is official marketing by a startup that was operating. It targeted older adults who may be even more vulnerable because perhaps they already have some memory issues, or certainly can be financially more vulnerable, more isolated. So all this led the FTC to conclude that Lumosity had deceived its consumers with unfounded claims. But by the time all this played out, Lumosity had recruited 70 million brain trainers from 182 countries. A much more recent example is the Cerebral story, and Cerebral was founded January 2020, so right before the pandemic. It promised to democratize high-quality mental health care using digital health technology. So when you talk about democratizing, you talk about increasing access, which is a wonderful goal to have. Except it fell into the trap that we just covered with Lumosity in terms of getting way ahead of the science and way aggressive in some of its messaging. So, the CEO appeared with his psychiatrist father and his therapist mother. They hired Simone Biles, who you may remember as the Olympic athlete who withdrew from the Olympics for a mental health condition that she was quite open about. They hired her as their chief impact officer, and they ran something that they called the Summer Olympics sale. They were very aggressive in advertising on Instagram and TikTok. So tactics that sit uncomfortably in the medical care model and belong a lot more maybe in the corporate world, and when you're selling things other than mental health services. Anyway, it became the go-to teleprovider for stimulants, and attracted eventually significant scrutiny, including from the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission. So I wanted to highlight again these two examples just to learn from this long history as we enter this new brave world of AI therapy, because that silver lining I talked about can easily turn into quite a dark future if we don't take the necessary precautions. So with that, thank you very much, and I'll turn it back over to Carolyn.
Elias,